Sounds good. Hello, everyone, and Shabbat Shalom to all those who celebrate Shabbat. As was wonderfully introduced by Mara, that I am Rabbi Ari Sachs. I live in Philadelphia with my family, and sometimes go to Rhode Island for the shul work that I do. But I had just finished 11 years in a full-time pulpit, trying out a lot of new things, including some of this interfaith family work. And also, one thought is for some folks, I'm also launching a curriculum for Jewish grandparents of interfaith families. So if you're interested in any conversation around interfaith families, would love to talk to you more about it. So we're going to just launch into the Torah learning for today, but I want to kind of give a little bit of background as to what I'm going to be focusing on. So I was here one time before, and at that time, I was emphasizing a little bit how that according to documentary hypothesis, that there are multiple different authors or multiple different voices that appear in Torah, and that these voices come from different places within early ancient Israel. For instance, you have sources from the Davidic kingdom in the south. You have sources from the northern kingdom. You have sources that kind of are trying to reform the way in which politics had worked, which I think we could all agree that reform of politics is something that's still on everyone's mind. And I'm going to actually touch on this because the question I really want to be asking is that in this Torah portion, we have the final set of plagues, but in the middle of the final plague, like if you think about it as a storyline, right? And if you're creating a movie of all the different plagues, and in the very last plague, the most important one, you have Moses going to Pharaoh and saying, "This is what's going to happen, but all the firstborn are going to die." And then in the middle of that, you get a command to count the beginning of the months. What? Now there's a commandment. He's just kind of making a schedule. It's like it would be if you were watching the movie and it was following exactly the way that Torah was written, it would be one of I think the greatest moments of this just doesn't make any sense. And it would be so anticlimactic to have the beginning of the plague and then talking about the calendar. So what gives with that? And I want to talk about that in two different ways. The first way I want to talk about it is through the perspective of having different authors or different voices within Torah, because if we look at it in that way, I think it actually would make a lot of sense. The second way I want to do it, though, is from the traditional rabbinic commentary perspective that can't separate the story of the final plague and all the different plagues in Egypt and the exodus from Egypt in general with this particular command to count the beginning of months. And so they don't have the freedom as maybe we do in this later age to be able to look at the different sources in a critical way. They were trying to say all of this makes sense because this comes from God directly. So how can we make sense of something that is so anticlimactic as it is? All right. So that's kind of the basic plan of what we're going to be doing here today. I'm going to be sharing my screen with the text that we're going to be using, but please feel free to look at it on your own. So I want to start with just a kind of a basic understanding of the different sources that are found within the text of Torah and how they're identified by scholars. So one of them is called the Yahwist source or the J source. This was composed, the earliest composition, in about the 10th century before the Common Era during the reign of King Solomon. As such, it was very friendly to the Davidic kingdom, to Solomon's kingdom, very much in government favor. And I want you to think about that in terms of the role that a government might play in so far as the crafting of a national epic that bolsters their claim. And within that line, also think about in the back of your mind that according to Jewish tradition, that the Messiah will come from the line of King David. Okay? So that King David in many ways represents the symbol of this individual who is going to save all of Israel. So we're going to keep that in mind. The second source is the Elohist source, otherwise known as E. This was composed a little bit earlier, or sorry, a little bit later, the 9th century before the Common Era. And this was in northern Israel. One of the things about this particular source is that it occurred after the disruption of the United Monarchy, meaning that you had one all of Israel that was really under the reign of David and Solomon. And then after that, then the kingdom was actually divided, and you had a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And this northern kingdom, in a certain sense, kind of responded against the way in which the southern kingdom acted and said we need to be a reform in many ways on that southern kingdom. So as you can see, they put a special emphasis on religiously and an ethically obligated community, and that God is also much more center than necessarily the political dynasty of David, meaning that we want to kind of reemphasize that we are a people of God and not necessarily that God has sort of given us power through the kingdom of David. Okay, so there are many ways of reform on that J source. Then you have the Deuteronomistic source. I'm not sure if that's the right way to pronounce it. It's one of those hard words. This is again an earlier source from the 7th to 8th century before the Common Era. This was in the South. Again, another kind of reform on the kingdom of Judah. And it also kind of gave more emphasis to the covenant with God, meaning that God is really the source of all aspects of religious fidelity and of social justice. Now, the interesting piece of this is that even though this may be in going chronologically, the third or the fourth sources in terms of age, in many ways, it also acts as a bit of a fixing of an even later source, which is the P source, known as the priestly source. This priestly source was composed in the 5th to 6th century before the Common Era, and the goal of this source, the priestly source, was to emphasize the institutional and ritual constitution of Israel as understood by the priestly cult, meaning that this was the source that focused on all of the sacrifices. How do you do the holidays? What are the different rituals ascribed to what Israelite religious life looks like? Okay. So those are the 4 different sources. The 2 that we're going to focus on a little bit more are the Yahweh source and the priestly source. So the Yahweh source, the J source, is focused on the kingdom of Judah, with David and Solomon. And then the priestly source is the one about the institutions of sacrifice. And this section of text that we have from Exodus 11 and 12 in our Torah portion is primarily made up of these 2 sources, and they kind of intermix between the 2. And I'm not going to actually read through, but I just want you to see it visually. The Yahweh J source is going to be in blue. The priestly P source is in red. So if you take a look, beginning of chapter 11, this is the beginning of the plague of God saying, here's going to be this plague of the firstborn. And then all of a sudden, before you get to Exodus 12, the priestly source comes in. And the priestly source is the one that talks about the months. Okay? The priestly source is the one that talks about the months. It goes much further. And then this last sort of bolded line that we're going to take a look at a little bit later is also, again, about setting the calendar. And then you have back to the J source, a little bit more of the P source, then the blue source, then the red source, then the blue source, back and forth all the way until the end of chapter 12. Now, by the way, this is a really interesting way of reading Torah. And there is a book by Elliot Friedman called The Bible with Sources Revealed, where he basically does this job for you, where you kind of look at all of the different texts of the Bible as it's understood as what we scholars believe to be written by certain sources. And so you can actually read Torah in that way just to get a sense of how these different sources are kind of in conversation with one another. All right. Now, the other thing I want to make sure is clear is that it's not like you basically took 4 different versions of Torah and kind of smashed them all together as one. That's not what this is in terms of what these sources are really all about. What this is to say that there are different kind of voices that appear in Torah. And eventually, when it became fully redacted and fully authored, that these sources appeared in certain different places. Therefore, there are probably sections or probably stories that are not included in the final text, but that, and because we don't have those particular stories, it is hard for us to simply say, well, let's put all of like the, for lack of a better term, the red sources together and the blue sources together and say, okay, this is a complete text and this is a complete text. You can't really do that. But I do want to do that right now. And the reason I want to do that right now is because, one, we don't really have any other sources to kind of look at to say, how could this have been filled in if we were only looking at the way that, let's say, the priestly tradition looks at the story of the Exodus, or that the Yahwist tradition looks at the story of Exodus. I want to do it, though, because I think it helps us understand a little bit more of the interplay between Rosh Chodesh and the story of the Exodus, and both why it appears here and also why it seems that it should not appear here. Okay? So we're going to read this almost as if we're just looking at a version of Torah from the J source and a version of Torah from the P source. Okay? So we're going to read from the Yahwist J traditions. And God said to Moses, I will bring out one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he shall let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. Tell the people to borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers, objects of silver and gold. God disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people. Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people. Now, I want you to notice something. Moses was esteemed by the Egyptians. God was not necessarily esteemed by the Egyptians. And Moses is speaking for God, yes, and says, this is what God says, but it's not as if God is actually speaking in this moment. It's Moses speaking on behalf of God to the people. And what that means is that perhaps Moses is actually the center of the story. And what the J source might be doing, again, to go back to the point of where does the J source come from, perhaps is to say, hey, Israel, guess what? Yes, there may be a God, or yes, there is a God, but really, we find our salvation through an individual who represents God to us. In the Torah, it was Moses, and for us, it's King David and King Solomon. Okay? I want you to see if that bears out. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. And whenever we bring in documentary hypothesis, there's always people who are really inspired by it. There's people who are really challenged by it. So we're getting a lot of comments in the chat. So one, just thank you for bringing this Torah to us today. We do have a few questions just to clarify a little bit.
Sure, please.
So can you, Janet is asking, are these different authors, different sources, or different perspectives on the Torah? So can you talk about how the viewpoints?
Yeah, so it's right.
Yes,
so it's yes and that's kind of what I'm trying to show here, is that it is different ways of almost writing Torah or having different Torahs that they're trying to get across. And at the same time, it is a perspective on Torah, meaning it is trying to bring out a certain element of Torah. Or let me put it to you this way. All right. I bet that if all of us here, if I ask the question, what does God look like to you? We would get, how many people are in here? We have
254.
254. We probably have 3 times that number of opinions about what God looks like and what God's all about. And what we do is we read Torah, we read religious scripture in a way that reflects our understanding of what God is. And there are certain texts that speak to us more than others. In a certain sense, that's kind of what is happening here, meaning that you have these different sources or perspectives that take certain traditions that had been passed down, but because of where they may be located or because of their influence, they're authoring them, or they're redacting them, or they're just playing with them in a way where they are taking older traditions and they're also inputting their particular views on it. So what I'd like to do is, if I can, I just want to go through this section. We're going to kind of move a little bit quickly through this section. And then I also want you to see the next section about Rosh Chodesh, because that's the section of Rosh Chodesh that I think really speaks to how when we look at these different sources, it can give us a lot of context for why the Torah is written in a certain way that it's written. Okay? So we have here, so then we have Moses saying, again, speaking on behalf of God, toward midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every male firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl. Just going to kind of move a little bit further. After that, I will depart, and he left Pharaoh's presence in hot anger. Okay? So he left them in hot anger. Now, if you're looking at that text in terms of the whole chapter 11 to chapter 12, this is basically where you would get the Rosh Chodesh piece. But instead, if you read this just from the J source, this is the next thing. Moses then summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and apply some of the blood that is in the basin to the lintel and the 2 doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of your house until morning, for God, when going through to smite the Egyptians, will see the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and God will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your and smite your home. Those assembled then bowed low in homage. Right? Think about it from like a movie perspective. You've got him speaking to Pharaoh, being so angry that Pharaoh is not listening at all to what he is saying. And then what he does, he goes back to his people and says, this is what you need to do to prepare, because God is coming. The destroyer is coming. And so it's like the anticipation of that moment in the movie where you know something is going to happen and everyone's getting ready with the final things that they're doing. And then in the middle of the night, God struck down all the male firstborn. And Pharaoh rose in the night with all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go worship God as you said. Take also your flocks, your herds, and may you bring a blessing upon me also. Almost as if saying, Moses, I need you to be my God. Which, by the way, that actually occurred in last week's Torah portion, where God said to Aaron, God said to Moses, you shall be a God to Pharaoh, and that Aaron shall be your prophet. Aaron shall be your mouthpiece. So in a certain sense, Moses is kind of also replacing Pharaoh here, which is then emphasized by this last piece. So the people took their dough before it was leavened. And by the way, it doesn't tell us why it was leavened. Why it was not leavened. Their kneading bowls wrapped in their cloaks upon their shoulders. The Israelites had done Moses' bidding and borrowed from the Egyptians objects of silver and gold and clothing. And God had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their request, and they stripped the Egyptians. I bolded this because the Israelites had done not God's bidding, but Moses's bidding. Now, by the way, thinking about this interplay between Moses and his role vis-a-vis almost as like that figure who was like God, taking this theory a little step further. Anybody, if you know, feel free to, I'm going to stop the chair for just a quick second and just give me a thumbs up. Do you know the story of the Moses and the rock, right? Moses speaking to the rock. Everybody know that story? All right. 2 versions of that story. First version, God tells Moses, hit the rock. He hits the rock and you have water come forth. That's version 1. Version 2, God says to Moses, speak to the rock. And he speaks to the rock, nothing happens. He hits the rock. And because he hits the rock and the water comes out, but he did not do it through speaking, God said to Moses, you're now going to die. You're not going to be able to see Israel. That first source, in terms of that it worked, that's the J source. That's the source from the Davidic kingdom. The second source, the one having to do with the fact that he did not follow God and that he will die eventually, that's the Elohis source. That's the E source that came from the northern kingdom. That was a check on Davidic power. So to a certain degree, what they were doing in terms of the different views of Moses was to say he is not the God of Israel. And by the way, thinking about that as well in regards to the story of the golden calf, that when Moses went up the mountain, people said, you need to replace Moses with a god, almost as if they were thinking that Moses was God and not that there was actually a God above. Because also remember, from the perspective of Israel, Pharaoh was considered to be the god, one of the gods in Egypt, so God could definitely take human form. All right. So thinking about these different stories and the way in which they portray individuals, this version of our text, by looking at it only through the J source, is really emphasizing Moses's role, telling Pharaoh what's going to happen, getting his people ready, and then the plague happens. And the movie makes sense. Okay. But now let's take a look at the Rosh Chodesh piece, because again, the Rosh Chodesh piece is something that is new. So take a look at the priestly traditions. Now, God had said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you in order that my marvels may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron had performed all these marvels before Pharaoh, but God had stiffened the heart of Pharaoh so that he would not let the Israelites go from this land. By the way, just notice how it says Moses and Aaron. Most times in which the text says Moses and Aaron, it is generally considered to be a peace source because Aaron was in charge of the priestly cult. All of the priests came from him. And so the priestly sources trying to raise up Aaron is also this figure who's almost akin to Moses. Now, what's so interesting about this piece is that this section, now God had said to Moses, Pharaoh will not heed you, right? We have nothing about the previous plague. In fact, the last plague that may have been connected to the peace source was the plague of boils, which happened much earlier. And it was at that time in which, in the text itself, it said that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And so we're not even at the point of God hardening Pharaoh's heart. We have it that Pharaoh's not heeding. And so God's saying, Pharaoh's not going to heed you. It's just not going to happen. And because it's not going to happen, I need you to prepare for the eventuality that you are going to be my people, because I am going to find a way to get you out of Egypt, despite what Pharaoh might be doing. So it's time for you to get ready. In a certain sense, kind of what Moses was doing prior with telling the Israelites to put blood on the lintels. But this is how the peace source gets people ready. God said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall mark for you the beginning of the months. It shall be the first of the months of the year for you. Speak to the community leadership of Israel and say that on the 10th of this month, each of them shall take a lamb to a family, a lamb to a household. But if the household is too small for a lamb, let it share one with a neighbor who dwells nearby in proportion to the number of persons. You shall contribute for the lamb according to what each household will eat. It's so fascinating, this piece, and also the next one having to do with the kind of lamb without blemish, all the different things that this animal has to look like. It's almost as if you've got all of that you had this practice of sacrifice and people kept on making mistakes, and then the people in charge said, okay, well, this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it, and now I need you to do it the right way. It's as if they're learning how to be able to build a community of ritual practice, and the text has already worked out some of the details. Because thinking about the goal of the peace source is to emphasize the cult, emphasize the ritual, what they're doing here is setting up Israel not for life in the moment of Egypt, not saying this is about the last plague and how are we going to get out. This moment is about preparing for a life in which every year at this time, we are going to have a ritual that looks like this. And what's more, the counting of the months, the counting of the Jewish year really starts at this point, when by virtue of making this moment the beginning of the counting of the months, that all of the other holidays and all of the other rituals can be actualized. Because without a calendar, who knows when the holidays are? Who knows when you have to go do a ritual? And so what they're doing is to say, God is saying, Pharaoh's not going to do the job, so I'm going to have to do it for them. But for you to prepare to be a full society. And that's why the commandment for Rosh Chodesh appears here. Now, I know there's a hand raised, but I want to just finish this up, and then I'll take a break to get couple questions, because I also want us to look at some of the traditional sources that don't do this job of documentary hypothesis and also bring us something really important for us to learn. Okay? Now, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they are to eat. They shall eat the flesh that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. Okay, fine. But it doesn't really tell us necessarily why. All right. And in fact, if you go down, it says, this day shall be to you one of remembrance. You shall celebrate it as a festival to God throughout the ages. Remember, they're setting up the society for what ritual life is going to look like from now and forever until forever. You shall celebrate it as an institution for all times. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the very first day you shall remove leaven from your house. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day to the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. What the text does not say is why we have to eat unleavened bread. The text does not say it. In fact, if you were to read through this whole section, it just seems that unleavened bread is the kind of bread you use in a ritual sacrifice. It's like you don't want to use bread that you normally eat. You want to use special bread, and that's unleavened bread. But remember I said there's the Deuteronomistic history, which actually appeared before this TL, but I think is actually a reform in many ways on the ritual sacrifices, on the ritual, on the priestly cult, because it's in Deuteronomy 16, where it tells us the reason why we eat unleavened bread is because we did not have enough time to be able to make real bread to go out. It's in that moment when they're focusing on the ethical obligation, on the reasons why we do things, and the fact that it comes directly from God and because of what God had wanted us to do, and that this is all coming from God. That is when we learn about why we don't eat unleavened bread. But it doesn't appear here because perhaps for the perspective of the cult, unleavened bread is just what you use. As it says, you shall observe this day throughout the ages as an institution for all time. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. And again, you shall observe this institution for all time, for you and for your descendants. And when you enter the land that God will give you as promised, you shall observe this rite. Okay? And that's when we get the idea that the Passover sacrifice is because God's going to pass over us. So I'm going to pause right here, but I do, because it's 11 o'clock, only going to take questions for about 5 minutes, and then I want to get to the last pieces of text, because I do think it's very important for this conversation about the meaning of Rosh Chodesh and why it appears here. So I see, Brian, you have your hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, because I had mentioned this on one of the prior classes, and this is the perspective that I had looked on it in reference to being the time in Egypt. A lot of the traditions that were there and passed down from Adam down through Abraham, they were lost. They were secularized, and so that there was going to be this necessity for the reestablishment of the priestly traditions in terms of the interpersonal relationship of the nation with God. And these were the things that were necessary, so that when it comes from that perspective, at least the way I look at it is, okay, they were basically, a lot of them were starting anew. There was always going to be a group of people that were holding true to the traditions, what I would call the real true believers. And then there's everybody else who basically, some of them are
Right.
lukewarm. And then so that's in reference to that this.
Right. I just want to, because we have one more question, if you can just wrap up your point for.
Yes. And the other, and then going into the leavened bread, and then that was always my understanding about the that they had to get out, so they had to do it quickly. But it was one of those things that when you do the holidays and you do the celebrations, it's a solemn remembrance in terms of your connection with God, that this is what you had to do, so that you're not going to use leavened bread. You're going to use unleavened bread. Why? Because you never, ever, ever want to forget what had to happen for you to get out of Egypt,
Right.
and it was that God had done this, and so that
Right.
that's one of those things where. Anyway, that's what I wanted
Yeah.
to say. Thank you.
I appreciate your thoughts, Brian. Thank you. We're going to go to Jack, but I then only have 2 minutes and then want to get to the last piece.
Okay. In reading this whole text, we are led to believe that God's main purpose was to get us out of Egypt as an exodus. However, the underlying story here is God wants to prove to everybody that he is God. Through signs and wonders, he will not only change the Egyptians, but the Hebrews that are there will also have faith in God. So there are two topics really being taken on here. One is the Exodus, which is secondary, I believe, to the writing of this. And the other is to prove God is a singular, all God, universal God.
Right. And I think that, again, part of the idea here is that we have all different perspectives about what's happening. And a lot of these different perspectives can be found. But the pieces that I want to focus on right now is, let's not think of these different sources, these different ideas as sort of being separate, meaning we focus on this and we exclude that. The real amazing thing that traditional rabbinic commentators do, like we're going to look at Rashi, Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz, and the Ramban, is what they do is they start from the perspective, which I believe is extremely important for any serious student of Torah, to say, let's take all of the texts that we have as given in this way, and why is it given in this way? And that's what they try and do. So I'm going to share the screen so we can look at these last 3 texts, and then if there's time, maybe we'll take a few more questions. All right. The first is actually coming from Rashi, from the great French sage in the 11th century of the Common Era. And this is not on our text per se, but it's on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Now, the reason why it appears in chapter 1, verse 1 is a fascinating story, but I'm not going to get into it because it's not necessarily relevant for our conversation here, except that this is what he said that should have been at the beginning of Genesis. Rabbi Isaac said, the Torah, which is the law book of Israel, should have commenced with the verse from Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, this month shall be unto you the first of the months, which is the first commandment given to Israel. So from the perspective of Rashi, in terms of his role as a rabbi, thinking about it as like, if you have all these different sources and where they come from, rabbis, like what is their perspective? His perspective, like many rabbis, is that the Torah is a book of law. It tells us what to do, how to do it, and when to do it, and also the things of what not to do. And therefore, because it's a book of law, shouldn't it start with the first commandment? But if we go on into Rashi, which we're not going to do right now, you'll see how in that text he says, here's why we don't begin with that commandment. We would think that we should, but we don't. So again, even from his perspective of saying, here's what my perspective is on Torah, he is also saying that everything that appears before it is here for a reason, and now my job is to figure out an explanation for it. So I wanted to bring that in because I think it's a very important something to say about how Rashi understands this verse and the importance of this verse when it comes to understanding how the Torah could be viewed simply as a book of laws. But now let's get specifically to our question of why does Rosh Chodesh appear in the middle of this last plague? Ramban, or Nachmanides, who's a medieval sage from Spain, said the following. Now the purport of the expression, this month shall be unto you the beginning of months, is that Israel is to count this as the first of the months, and from it they are to count all months, second, third, etc., until a year of 12 months is completed, in order that there be this enumeration, a remembrance of the great miracle, i.e. the exodus from Egypt, which occurred in the first month. So that whenever we will mention the months, the miracle will be remembered. It is for this reason that the months have no individual names in the Torah, meaning it doesn't say the month of Iyar, doesn't say the month of Sivan, it doesn't say the month of Tishrei. It says the first month, the second month, the seventh month, because every time we do it, we're supposed to remember the Exodus. And that is why, according to the Ramban, this text has to appear before they actually leave Egypt, but at the moment, at the precipice of their leaving. Because by saying that this month, that this is the moment that we count the beginning of the months, what it's saying is, hey, Jews, hey, Israelites, this is the most important event in our history and will be the most important event in our history, even thinking about our entire future. And every time that we observe anything in this life that we are living, by virtue of starting the counting of months at this moment in time, we are remembering this great miracle that God is doing for us. And that's a beautiful teaching that can only come by understanding or asking the question, why does Rosh Chodesh appear here? Now, by the way, later on, I don't actually go through this, but I don't want to go through this right now, but he also says the same thing has to do with Shabbat, right? If you think about it, in Israel does not necessarily call it Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It says Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, first, second day. The real official way of saying it is Yom Rishon B'Shabbat, Yom Sheni B'Shabbat. The Shabbat is considered to be the centerpiece, the thing we remember, and then we count the days from that Sabbath day. That's how we remember it, so that every time we're counting, every day is related and goes back to Shabbat. So now here's my one of my favorite commentators, the Kli Yakar, or Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz from Poland, and he was the eventual leader of the Jewish community of Prague in the late 16th, early 17th century. Why do all the mitzvot begin with the sanctification of the moon? Right? Because what is the counting of Rosh Chodesh? It's not looking at the sun. It's seeing something new in the sky, that little glimmer of the moon. The Chodesh, which means month, literally means new because you get to actually literally see something new in the sky. So why do all the mitzvot begin with this sanctification of the moon? Kind of following up with Rashi. Rashi says this is the first commandment. Kli Yakar saying, why is it the first commandment? And why is this commandment connected to the sacrifice of the Passover? He's basically asking the question, why are we talking about the Rosh Chodesh having to do with Pesach? Right? This is kind of the essential question I'm asking. And Kli Yakar is in a certain sense asking it too. And the explanation is that the Egyptians believed that a shepherd's success was dependent completely on his lucky stars, or stars is really mazal, like constellations, okay? Because as the Talmud states, one's stars make one wise and wealthy, i.e., we don't necessarily have a full choice about if we're going to be so successful, but that you count your lucky stars, and then that'll lead us to be able to be successful. Thus, the sin of the Egyptians was to believe that all shepherds were successful because of their stars, which was not correct. Now, thinking about the story of Torah and why he's saying this. Abraham, shepherd. Isaac, shepherd. Jacob, shepherd. Moses, shepherd. The Israelites were shepherds. But as a shepherd, you let your flock go and you don't know if it's going to be successful, as opposed to what the Egyptians did, which was to farm the land as it was, because that was more, you could call it that it was not standard, but you could count on getting food and wealth from the land. You may not necessarily get it as a shepherd. Okay. But their sin is that they did not think that they thought that the success of shepherds had to do with the stars, with their constellations. That was not correct, because the director of everything, i.e. God, is the one who directs, who chooses the stars of the shepherds, right? That the stars actually report to God, but God is ultimately the one in charge. And that the relationship between Israel and God is direct, as opposed to other nations in which it's the relationship to the certain stars, of which, yes, God is over, but that it may not be in as direct of a relation to God directly. Okay? Thus, God commanded the Israelites to sacrifice a Passover offering, since the stars of the Israelites depended solely on God, who is above all the stars. So not only is it that the constellations are not applicable to Israel, but that the reason why this is mentioned at this point as Israel is about to leave is in order to tell the Egyptians, you are wrong about who this people is, about who they're all about, that in fact, they are special to God and God is going to care for them. And the fact that they are shepherds even makes that point further, because if they were working the land like you know, you can probably do a good job as a farmer and be able to know where your food's coming from. But as a shepherd, you have to rely upon something greater than you. And in this case, that is God. And that's why he needed to make this commandment at the beginning of all commandments, and for it to happen as part of the end of the Exodus story as they're about to leave. All three of those perspectives, Rashi, Ramban, and Kli Yakar, bring beautiful ways of understanding the teaching of Rosh Chodesh, but only because they're starting from the perspective that it's written here for a purpose to interrupt the flow of the story. And that by virtue of looking at the different sources, we can understand why these stories don't necessarily seem to make sense. That there is a logical explanation that also teaches us something about who Israel is. And my overall hashkafa, my overall perspective is that all of these sources, from the documentary hypothesis to the traditional commentaries, are holy, are important, are worthy of study, and bring us a holistic understanding of what Torah is supposed to teach us today.
What a beautiful way to close this out, Rabbi. And I just want to thank everyone for their attendance, for their engagement. It is so wonderful and beautiful to see what someone even called the yeshiva in the chat. It feels like a Beit Midrash, and your conversation really does add another layer of holiness to our Torah study together. So thank you all. And thank you, Rabbi, for sharing your thoughts and insights. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we wish you a very wonderful weekend, and Shabbat Shalom. See you next time.
Take care, everyone. Shabbat Shalom.